Just to let you know, this session is actually being recorded, so when you're asking questions and you don't want your voice to be heard, don't ask a question. Otherwise, if you are asking a question, could you possibly introduce yourselves from your institutions, so we know who you are? So Joy and I set up this session initially really to get a good panel together from two different points of view. That's from the practitioners here and from the funding councils. So it's meant to be quite an informal brainstorming session, but we really want to try and consider how to put together these policies together at policy level, so to speak. So we quite like the theme going through the 2 days of policy with a big P and policy with a small p. And should the funders, so to speak, be creating policies with a big P and feeding them through to the practitioners, or should it be the other way around? Should the funders be being prescriptive or not? So that's sort of some of the questions we're going to raise over the course of this session. But we also want to get some feedback from you about what role the DPC and the DCC could be playing as well with these policies. Should we be helping to coordinate them or certainly advertise them on our website? Someone made the interesting point today that people apply to a number of different funding councils. So where would the policies be coming from there? Should the funding councils be working together to create the policies? And should we be working to help promote them and instigate them? So we want some feedback from you. But first of all, I'm going to ask each of our panel members to speak for a few minutes on what their roles are and how they see the role that their institution can play in creating these policies and promoting them. And I'd just like to introduce Neil Jeffries, who hasn't spoken at this event, and Helen Hockx-Yu from JISC, who hasn't spoken either. But I think you know everybody else. So I'm not going to introduce them. I think they can introduce themselves. So I think we'll start with Neil.
Okay.
As beginning.
Neil Jeffries. I work for Oxford University Library Services, in charge of various repositories that we have, which variations on the idea of digital repositories. What I really want to talk about, I guess, is some points that have come up here that have really stuck with me, being on an institution, getting funding from these people to do things rather than as a funder or as one of the large national resources. Let's just have a look. One of the things I have to say is that at the moment we do not have a clearly defined policy for institution repositories in general or any particular repository as a whole. What we are basically doing is implementing in digital form, or as far as my project goes in terms of defining the scope, implementing in digital form what we do currently as a library. So that the types of things we collect are not large data sets, but things like postprint papers, theses, that sort of thing. So we're not collecting basically large volumes of data with possibly small amounts of metadata, but large numbers of smallish digital objects with, relatively speaking, quite a large amount of associated metadata. The other thing as a library we're doing is collecting in a repository digital surrogates, so scanned images or marked up text from a scanned image of various of our materials. So that's really defining the scope of the repository that we're looking at. In doing that, to some extent, we've defined our accession policy. In doing that, we're just saying we're going to do effectively what we do as libraries. In terms of retention, Bodleian being what it is, or Oxford University Library Services being what it is, we are actually planning for effectively indefinite retention. We don't really have a disposal policy for our books at large, which explains some of our storage problems, and likewise we intend to do the same thing digitally at the moment. And one of the things we intend to offer the institution as a whole is basically long-term preservation of their materials. One of the things that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, which I think is key to the long-term preservation, is really standards on digital object mobility, moving digital objects between repositories and across repositories. In that, really there are three ways where that comes into play. One is that any particular repository, piece of software, piece of technology, electronic records management, digital object management system, whatever you want to call it, will sooner or later become obsolete, and you will need to migrate your digital objects onto a newer system or a management system. And at the moment, really, there are no standards for saying, can we pick up a digital object in all its incarnations, if it's been migrated to different file formats, all its different versions, the associated metadata, the history of that object. There is no standard way of encapsulating that and moving it onto a new system. The same requirement also stems from the fact that institutional repositories have really sprung up as a result of the open access movement, not as a result of the preservation movement. And as a result, there tend to be a lot of departmental or subject-based repositories, all of which hold these objects. And one of the things we would like to do is, A, within an institution to be able to consolidate it, and B, on a wider scale, hold a digital object not only in an institutional repository, but ideally be able to migrate that to, say, a national resource or something like that. Because realistically, people are only going to want to deposit their digital object once. So it will go into a repository somewhere. And it would be nice if the other repositories which could have a claim on the interest, being purely pragmatic, have a claim on that object, could readily pick that up and bring that into their own systems, basically without really much intervention from the depositor. And I think that's just a pragmatic requirement, really, in terms of making things work. So you're really looking at, A, bridging the gap between the national and the institutional systems, bringing disparate institutional systems together into a single thing, and also migrating onwards from there. In terms of what we're doing in terms of drafting formal policy, we've been through the Sherpa process. We have an ePrints repository. We have several ePrints repositories, actually. But that experience has basically informed a lot of what we're doing now in what I would call the second phase. The first thing really is separating digital object management and storage as a back-end system, which we want to be open source, portable, have longevity, and be as generic as possible, from the workflows that relate to a particular data type, a particular type of material, a particular subject, and actually layer those on top. And at any particular point we can add to the application layer, remove from the application layer, remove things onwards without touching the core storage of that material. One of the ways in which that's important is we have dark archives, things like electronic parliamentary papers, people's emails and stuff we're collecting as part of a project called Paradigm. Now, we're collecting all that, putting it into an archive, but there's no point devising a delivery mechanism, because this stuff is not going to be delivered to anybody. In fact, definitely can't be delivered to anybody for legal reasons for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So there's no point designing a delivery mechanism because it will be obsolete before anybody's ever used it. So we've got to try and design for storage without actually thinking about really at the moment delivery. What we're trying to do is develop that in parallel with our open archive so that we have basically two silos, one closed and one open. And when the time comes that we can release the material, we can then physically move stuff from one to the other. And it will be a physical movement. The closed archive is not even connected to the network in any way. Essentially because that's the only way we can guarantee the level of security that will be required for these sorts of materials. Finally, in terms of coming to the second phase of it, what we've done really in terms of getting clearly defined policy, big P, as opposed to the implicit policy through our role as library, is effectively forming a steering group for the repository project that we have, and really bringing in things, heads of divisions, pro-vice-chancellors, people at the very top to actually be involved and get buy-in in terms of setting those guidelines and driving it forwards. But as I said, I don't see our role as really supplanting things like the national services, in that we're aiming to store a different sort of material. We just don't have the expertise or the ability to handle large data sets. What we're doing really is extending our role as a library into the electronic realm, but not extending the range of digital materials that we take. Okay.
Thank you very much. Andrew Wilson from AHDS, from a collector's point of view.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm going to assume that you all know about the AHDS. Is that right? Would that be right? Yes? Yes? No? Well, very briefly, AHDS is the data archive for the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is a higher education funding body. We collect, our selection policy is basically we select everything that's output by arts and humanities research projects in the higher education sector falls within our selection criteria. So, as Kevin was saying earlier this morning, there is a difference between selection and appraisal. At the moment, our selection policy is basically set out by whatever the document that sets up the AHDS is, the document that gives the AHDS its mission and purpose, which is something that was negotiated between AHRC and King's College, where the executive is hosted. So there's an executive at King's College, there's 5 distributed data services around the country: archaeology at York, history at Essex, language, literature and linguistics at Oxford, performing arts at Glasgow, and visual arts and Surrey Institute of Art and Design. And the 5 data services actually handle data deposit and the relationship with depositors, and also have a lot of guidance role. So that's really a very brief overview of what AHDS is. As I said, our selection policy is to take everything from arts and humanities research projects that are funded by the AHRC or the British Academy in the arts and humanities sector of the UK higher education community. We don't actually have an appraisal policy at the moment. We take everything, although we are actually talking about changing that particular approach, because we're going to get into the sort of problems that Kevin mentioned when he was talking about appraisal and selection. We have 3 what I might call, what Malcolm Todd might have called big P policies. One, which is a collection policy, includes statements about our policy on ingest, about the scope of our collections, about preservation, about storage, and about access. We have another high-level policy, which is a technical policy, which is basically about our hardware and software environment and the sort of development environments that we use for developing software. And a communication policy, which is the policy about, it's actually AHDS looking outwards at its constituency, the people that we serve, or our user groups, and as well as the data creators, but also the communication policy deals with sort of outreach things and generally high-level stuff about our interface between the interface between AHDS and the public. So they're all high-level policies, which are really sort of general statements about what we'll do and how we work. Below those are a whole lot of what Malcolm would call small p policies, although I wanted to make a point, which is probably true of a lot of organisations like AHDS, that a lot of the policies aren't actually explicit. They're contained within statements about other policy. A lot of them you actually have to infer from our procedures or workflow. So a lot of the policies which really inform the way we operate aren't actually explicit. We are doing something about trying to make them more explicit, but at the moment a lot of things just happen because that's the way we do them. They're not actually, there's no stated policy for the way we'll handle particular, the way we'll work, or the way we make decisions about what we'll actually do. But we do have a lot of, sorry, I just want to read a little extract from the collection policy, which really sets out the aim of the collection policy, which is what I'm going to talk about, because I mean my role at AHDS is preservation services and projects manager, so the collection area is my responsibility. This little statement that I wanted to read, because it really encapsulates what we're trying to do, is the aim of the collection policy, or the aim of the AHDS's collection work, is to manage the resources of at each stage of its life cycle, and to recognise interdependencies between each stage and commence preservation activities as early as possible. And that last statement about commencing preservation activities as early as possible is really a sort of policy statement, because we take that as a basis for getting involved, or trying to be involved in data creation before we actually get deposits of data. So we have generally our policy is that we want to try and influence data creators to create good resources, or resources that can be easily preserved over time. So one of the things we do, which Kevin mentioned, is giving advice to prospective research applicants for the AHRC funding programs. So we give them advice about data creation, about the sorts of the file formats they should be using, about things like backup, web access, and all those sorts of technical issues involved in creating digital outputs from research projects. As Kevin says, and I tend to agree with him, we're not actually sure that that's really working, but at the moment it's really all that AHRC mandates us to do. We don't have any, AHRC doesn't have a policy which lets us actually mandate to any extent what data creators do. So, I mean, and that's probably something the AHRC should be getting into, but it's not really the role of AHDS. I mean, we can advise and try and influence, but there's no policy which says AHDS can mandate how data creators behave. So that's an issue that we have to address, and I think the AHRC will have to address it in the very near future. But just to summarise the sorts of things that we have, which are really sort of policy documents, a whole lot of guides to good practice on digitisation. So, I mean, we're trying to tell data creators how to create, how to digitise to good standards, so that we can get the sorts of digital resources from digitisation projects that we can preserve over time. So we have a lot of guides to good practice about digitisation. We have guides to good practice on resource creation, or digital resource creation. We have a number of things which we call preservation handbooks, which set out a whole lot of information about the sorts of file formats that you come across in particular areas, like spreadsheets, GIS, CAD, databases, audio, moving image, and so on. There's a whole range of them. I won't go through them all. But they set out a whole lot of information about particular file formats, about why some are better for preservation formats than others. And also there's quite a lot of information about what we call the significant properties of those file formats are. So the things that we want to retain over time, the aspects of the information and the context that we want to retain over time. So that's a lot of really, I think, excellent advice for data creators about how to go about data creation. And Jen actually had an example of that back of that sheet that she showed this morning had a summary of all the recommendations of the preservation handbooks. We have a policy on acceptable data formats. So, I mean, we don't actually have anything stated, but on our website there's a list of acceptable data formats for deposit, which is also, again, a policy statement, if you like, that's been extracted from all the preservation handbooks. So it sets out which formats are preferred, which formats are acceptable, which formats are problematic. We have a series of internal working documents called ingest manuals, which are really, in themselves, are not policy documents, but they're a reflection of a policy about managing ingest, managing the ingest process. So they set out the workflow and procedures that each of the data services follow for ingesting records. So even really from pre-ingest up to ingest, and they cover things like metadata, license forms, and all that sort of ancillary information that you need in order to make digital resources available. So they're a reflection of our policy on ingest. We have a policy on what media we can accept for data transfer. So again, there's nothing stated, but there's a document on our website which says these are the media you can use to transfer digital resources on. So in effect, that's stating a policy about data transfer options. We obviously have a metadata policy because we collect metadata from depositors. We have a catalogue which is available from our website, which covers all the resources deposited in AHDS. So it's a reflection of our metadata and our collection policy to some extent. Our catalogue is only at collection level at the moment, so again, that's a reflection of a policy that we won't, for the moment, we're only describing resources at collection level, not at item level, although we're about to change that. But that's a reflection of our policy, even though it may not be written down, and I don't think it is. So we have standards for metadata creation. As I said, we have a lot of guides and standards about preservation formats. the collection policy, which I mentioned before, actually has a summary of our preservation approach, which is based on migration. But that's set out in our collection policy. And also we have a lot of, I'm not going to go into detail because I'm running out of time, but we have policies about access, about the fact that our intention is to give access as widely as possible to the public in essence, although our primary audience are higher education researchers. But in fact, anyone can access our resources from our website, so that, I mean, that's part of our access policy, which is also outlined in the collection policy document. So, I mean, that's really a brief encapsulated version of the sorts of policies that we use to manage our operations day to day. But, I mean, again, I just want to make the point that a lot of them aren't explicit, that you do have to infer a lot of our policies from other procedural or workflow documents. I think that's all I want to say.
Okay. Kevin, do you have anything to say from...
Yeah, I can say a few things. One of the good things about following a speaker from the AHDS is that you can always say, well, we do all of that too, because he said it all already. So that's great. I don't have to say any more about that. What I'm going to do is talk about a few issues and areas that I don't think anybody has yet talked about. The first one is that everybody agrees pretty much, certainly in this room, that preservation is important. One of the big problems, however, is that funders are not always ready to acknowledge its importance. What I mean by that is that even organisations like my own, where we receive a lot of funding from the Research Council, and I don't mean to talk for Andrew, but to a certain extent this is true of AHDS as well, who obviously receives a lot of money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. From their point of view, the emphasis is very much about access, about delivery. If you look at our SLDs, our service level definitions, our KPIs, our key performance indicators, they're all very much geared towards what research are we enabling and facilitating. It's not about preservation per se. The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of people think preservation is important, but very few people are prepared to put real money into it. And that in itself is a problem, because there are other drivers to do, particularly within the academic sector, to do with research outputs which override preservation issues. So the first thing I would say is that we need to get that kind of balance right, and we haven't got that balance right. And one of the reasons I think we haven't got the balance right is because, despite of the important work of people like the DCC and the DPC, sorry, I had to pause then for a moment, sorry, is that I don't think we still know enough, and we don't discuss enough about the costs and the risk factors associated with preservation. What I mean by that is that preservation is often taken for granted. It's always somebody else's problem. You know, the archivist or the librarian or whoever it might be will pick up the pieces. And of course, well, you know, that's a good thing and that's funded anyway. They're paid to do that sort of stuff. Well, are we actually paid to do that stuff? You know, let's look at the economics of preservation. I don't think we actually know enough about the economics of digital preservation. I can tell you how much it costs to ingest certain data sets that we take in. But then how do you count the costs of preservation over a year, 5 years, 10 years, 40 years, 50 years? We don't have enough information there, and we don't know what the other economic opportunities are. If we don't invest that money, what are the risks of not making that investment in terms of future research? So I think we perhaps need to do a lot more research on the whole economics of preservation in order to perhaps make our arguments stronger. Okay, change subject. An issue that hasn't been talked about is authentication. Authentication, of course, is one of the things that's talked about in the OAIS model. One of the things that comes under the SIP is that one should carry out authentication to make sure that these records are what they purport to be. Again, that's something which we perhaps don't do enough of, particularly in the social sciences and possibly in the humanities as well. It's not always clear how you define what an authentic record is, and without getting into too much of the linguistics of it, certainly if you talk to archivists about provenance and what provenance means and what a true record is, they might have very different views about what is an electronic record. I remember talking once to the National Archivist in Sweden, and his view is that the only true electronic record, the only authentic electronic record, given that what we're meant to be preserving is the actions of the state, and not the data, but the SQL queries that were run on those data. What I'm asking here and asking you to think about is, do we really still fully understand what it is that we should be preserving? We often focus on data, but if we really want to understand how those data have been interacted with and used, maybe we should be preserving something slightly different. And we need to think about that. It doesn't mean that we throw one thing away, but we might want to extend our mental landscape of what this collection actually is. And one of the things that certainly we want to do, because we're increasingly working in a global society where later this year we will launch a pan-European collection of catalogue of social science data called CCAT, which enables people to search simultaneously across something like 6 or 8 data archives across Europe. Then we get into real issues of version control and edition control, because what you will actually find within that catalogue is that there are titles of data sets that seem to be the same in different archives. So which is the real one? What's the master copy? Is this copy in the French archive actually subtly different from the one in the German archive? And if so, how? So we need a kind of ISBN, an international standard for identifying data sets and the products derived from data sets. So it's both identification, authentication, and an issue of version control there. And particularly as we move into a global environment where you may have data objects that exist in subtly different forms at a national level, we need to think about how we represent that within a resource discovery network. The last thing I want to say is that unfortunately I wasn't here yesterday when David Ryan was here, because I'm sure he would have had a lot of interesting things to say about it. But if I can give you one message to take away if you're starting to work on digital preservation, it is Lifecycle. Lifecycle really, really matters when it comes to digital objects. In this report that I talked about, the regional report, one of the key things it highlights is that the costs, the economics, the sheer ability of being able to save things are all influenced by Lifecycle. And it relates to the points that Andrew was making about the relationship he has with his funders, the AHRC, and with the researchers. One of the things that we have stressed on with the ESRC is that if we are going to do our job in the most efficient and effective way as data preservers, we have to be involved in the digital life cycle from the earliest possible stages, because then you can hopefully preempt and predict some of the problems on the way. You can actually have a working relationship with the data creators to ensure that problems that might arise as a result of consent, that might result of IPR, copyright, data format, whatever it might be, are hopefully addressed and therefore minimised at the time when the research is being paid for. The irony for archives like mine, and to a certain extent like Andrew's as well, and this is true of so many archives around the country dealing with traditional materials, is that we're faced with having to solve a problem at the end of the life cycle when there are neither the resources or possibly the people around to solve them, if you see what I mean. So life cycle is critically important. Do not delay preservation to the end of the life cycle. Think of it as a life cycle phenomena. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, on to funding. Funders. Would anyone like to start?
Everyone's
Allan?
staring at me, so I guess it's me.
Life cycle?
So, how can I not agree with what Kevin says? I think, I guess, to pick up on that point directly, what Kevin alludes to is the sort of retrofit. I think historically, a lot of the hypothesis-driven focused research projects that generate data that MRC has funded have been funded as such, and now when the value of the data resources that those projects have generated is seen to have wider use and value, that's when then you're having to go back retrospectively and think about what you should have done at the start in order to make sure that other people could use that data and make best use of it in a meaningful way. So I guess that's really just restating the issue rather than providing a particular solution for it. I think one aspect of trying to move that forward is not only trying to work with the researchers to make sure that that happens, but also working with the peer review bodies that influence the decisions around the funding of these applications prospectively as well, to try and build it in at the start of the process, as well as making judgments about, okay, this is a specific research project and these are the aims, but what are the other things which can be done with the data that this research will be generating? And it's trying to get that sort of change of mindset across the board. We talked during the discussions today about policy with a big P and policy with a small p, and some of the people on the table have spoken about what they view as implicit policy, in that these are the procedures and the practices that people are using within their own research teams, whether they be data managers, curationists, experts, or the people responsible for generating and gathering the data. I think another way maybe of looking at this implicit policy is really, particularly if it's successful and being adopted and actually promotes the ethos that I think we all buy into, is actually recognising that this is good practice rather than implicit policy. And there is a real need to give visibility to this, even within research communities, so that research group A know that research group B are doing some really good things, and they are often at not very much expense could actually think about doing those things themselves. So given that sort of that cross-domain visibility, which, okay, the approaches may not be adopted, but at least you then provide a testing ground and a mechanism for validation across those people which the small policy will actually affect. I talked earlier today about how MRC policy had evolved, how it looked to international policies and other successful models, and how a series of consultations with those people that would be affected by the policy, both directly and indirectly, actually led to the evolution of it. I suppose what I wanted to emphasise is I don't really do think this is an evolutionary process. I think there's a real need to look at the needs of the users and those people that are affected by the policy, to look at the risks associated with the various aspects of the policy, the benefits, obviously, the costs, which I'm sure we'll probably pick up again in questions, and think about this as well in terms of the environments, because Costs for certain types of approaches will come down, new approaches will evolve, practices across the community will be either adopted or wither away, and really you're not ever going to really have a successful policy that doesn't take account of the environment in which that policy sits and is expected to act within. I suppose the last point I wanted to make in relation to that really was this idea that to actually have a mechanism that supports policy and its implementation at a local level, you really, although you can have the centralised aspect which draws in this information and may act as a decision-making body, it really does need to be embedded in a research or whatever user community so that it can evolve along with the things that I've mentioned, but also it's an interactive and iterative process. It's not something that can be done at the exclusion of those people which it affects.
Thank you, Alan. Helen, on to you. Just perspective.
Okay, my name is Helen Hockx-Yu, and I'm sorry I wasn't at the first part of the workshop, but today I would like to talk to you to tell you a little bit more about the policies JISC has in place in terms of making sure that good practices are followed and the resources created by the projects we found are properly managed. I don't think there is such a single document which specifies JISC's data policy, but it's rather a set of policies and procedures which applies not only to our internal records and data management, but as well as to the project that receives JISC funding. So I'll skip the internal bit because and concentrate on how we make sure grant conditions and policies for JISC funded creation of digital resources are put in place. As you know, we found a wide variety of research and development projects to trial technology which might be potentially beneficial to the UKDA and FE community. And these projects lead to a range of outputs, including software, content, services, reports, studies, learning. It is important that we make sure these outputs are captured for wider dissemination, and secondly, for possible future reuse. All the JISC-funded projects have to sign a grant letter, which is a contractual agreement between JISC and the institutions that receives the JISC funding. The grant letter sets requirements in terms of intellectual property rights, reporting, and audit and consortium agreements. But it also includes a section called grant conditions, which includes a specified agreed proposal for which the funding is awarded. And this is usually the bid that an institution would submit to JISC, which would have gone through an evaluation process and have become successful. It also refers to the generic terms and conditions of grant, which all JISC projects must adhere to. I'll pick out a few relevant bits from the terms and conditions just to share with you how policies are set in terms of project output. But it also refers to a project management guidelines, which sort of explains how JISC's development program work, what is expected from JISC-funded projects, and what kind of project management framework they must have in place to manage the project. So the terms of conditions, for example, says that project, for example, requires project deliverables are deposited in the appropriate JISC data centers or managed repository. And it also defines a set of core project documents and specifies what stage these documents must be submitted and completed by the project. And the detailed explanation and standard templates for these documents are available as part of the project management guidelines. And the terms and conditions also refers to JISC guidelines and standards, which is a document that provides guidelines and practices critical to developing, managing, and delivering digital resources online. The JISC's development work is based on the use of open standard to make sure that we support interoperability and maximize accessibility, but also this, using open standard helps to ensure long-term preservation. When it comes to projects which deliver e-learning related output, where IPR and other conditions permit, JISC mandate that these outputs are deposited in Durham, which is a national repository service for e-learning materials. And the terms and conditions also says that each project must have a website and requires the lead institution or one of its partners to agree to host the website on their service for a minimum of 3 years after the end of the project, and to assist JISC in archiving it subsequently. I'll come to the bit what happens after 3 years later in my talk. And so these are the relevant clauses which relate to how project outputs are managed. There are 12 other areas where detailed requirements are set, such as intellectual property rights, quality assurance, payment schedule, even staff development, but I shall not go into that here. A relevant document which is mentioned in the project management guideline is JISC's open source policy for JISC-funded projects. It not only applies to projects which produce software as output, but for all, it applies to all JISC-funded projects and services. So it explicitly says the following: documentation, graphics, sound, data, and other files must use open standards. All outputs must be released in a form with no DRM, digital rights management restrictions. All outputs must be realized in a form which complies with applicable accessibility guidelines. All outputs must have clear copyright statements indicating the ownership of the copyright and the output and the license under which it is being distributed. And finally, all electronic outputs must be archived in a repository with a written preservation strategy. Very good. So all these, there are 5 documents which I sort of briefly mentioned. All together, they inform the obligations of the JISC, of the institutions receiving JISC funding during the term of funding, which are the grant letter itself, the generic terms and conditions, the project management guidelines, the JISC guidelines on standards, and an open policy for JISC projects. So at policy level, we have, through these documents, we make it very clear to the institutions which receive JISC funding what are expected from them in terms of responsibilities and obligations, but also how they should manage their outputs, and the standards guideline, for example, even specifies the file format you should choose, you must use, and standard you should follow. But in addition to these conditions and guidelines at policy level, where appropriate, we're also engaged with the assessment and development of secure long-term repositories at national level for the assets which we have developed. I mentioned Durham, which is the National Repository for Electronic Learning and Teaching Material. Another example is the website, project website, created by JISC-funded projects. So I just said, we require that all projects host the website for at least for maximum of 3 years after the funding has ended. But during these 3 years, websites are actually selected, permissions for archiving are obtained, and the websites are then harvested and archived by the University of London Computing Centre on behalf of JISC. This is part of the UK Web Archiving Consortium, of which JISC is a partner. And actually, we have now expanded the scope of the websites we're archiving beyond JISC-funded projects. For example, DPC's website, I've understood, has also been archived under this project. The next step, actually, is to build the permission for archiving into the grant letter so that it can be obtained in advance and will save us a lot of time and effort to go around and ask everyone's permission. E-journal archiving is another area in which JISC is trialing technology to assess and develop a service to ensure the continued access of licensed electronic journals. We recently started a pilot on the logs system, for those who know what it is, but otherwise I can provide you with more details afterwards. Another point I want to make is that JISC's responsibility actually goes beyond the project, which directly receives JISC funding, because as a committee, working with top-sliced funding, it is important that the output of activities deliver the maximum value and benefits the wider community. And I think we also have a responsibility of advocating good records and data management practices and the transferable experience, and to influence, rather than setting policies, to influence the wider community so that they are aware of the long-term preservation and curation issues related to digital resources, and can start to develop the skills needed to deal with these the related challenges. JISC has an ongoing digital preservation and records management program, and under that program we have funded many projects of which the output actually fulfill that requirement. And the program has also funded projects which developed supporting tools, documentations and models to support institutions carrying out digital preservation. Many of these outputs are hosted by JISC services and disseminated to the wider community. And I also want to, at last, I want to briefly mention the JISC Capital program, which is recently announced using its £80,000 capital comprehensive review funding. There is a strand called Digital Repositories and Preservation, which is going to invest 14 million into the further development and deployment of digital repositories by providing institutions with advice and guidance on repository management, with support in developing critical mass of content, and with a national infrastructure to support resource discovery and digital preservation across distributed repositories. I think the wide deployment of institutional repositories is a challenge, but at the same time also provide us with opportunities for new opportunities for digital preservation. But Kevin has stressed the importance of lifecycle management, and it is very important to start considering digital preservation even from the point of creation. I think much could be done to consider digital preservation from the outset, to involve the authors in contributing preservation metadata, for example, to create resources in preservable format, and to embed digital preservation into the repository workflow. And all these efforts will ease the later preservation tasks. So I think as well as clear guidelines and conditions at policy level, much has been done by JISC also to help implement these policies. And the repository, the capital program is yet another example. And yeah,
That's great.
what I have to say. Thank you.
I was acutely aware a lot of the audience here didn't come from the academic sector, didn't come from the academic research sector, and there was quite a few people I saw in the audience came from, you know, the county archives, county libraries, that sort of area. And I've been trying to think, you know, how do we apply what people have been talking about here into a sector which doesn't have that ready access to funding? You know, JISC JISC can put its money where its mouth is and tell people what to do. You know, NERC, MRC, we can put our money where our mouth is and say, right, we want you to manage your data like this, and we're going to give you resources to do this. How do you get that same good practice to work, which, like Heather speaking yesterday, you know, she's chasing around trying to capture the digital output of, you know, from the people in her county, but there's not the resources to follow it up. You know. And so I've been trying to think about what it is that we can do at a policy level, the big P policy level. You know, how can that be used to maybe help drive this context along? And I was trying to think what it is what the big P policies give you that can help sort of engender a respect for the value of information and so digital information. And I was going to use a couple of examples which probably seem totally unrelated. People may be aware of the Antarctic Treaty. The Antarctic Treaty covers the governance of the Antarctic. Article 3.1c of the treaty, I know this because I spent 12 years working in the Antarctic Survey, data management. Article 3.1c of the treaty actually just says that scientific data and results will be made freely available between treaty parties. That's all it says, but over the 50-odd years since it's over 50 years now, actually there's about 50 years since the treaty's been in place, that has developed a sort of mindset within people who work in the Antarctic that you are expected to work with others and share your data with others. You know, so a simple sort of political statement has engendered a recognition amongst people doing the work that there is a value in the data, and the data is a good thing to work with others and share your data with others. And you know, over the years we've been developing systems to manage and make available Antarctic data within the internationally within the science community. Now we're seeing something similar coming down the line now through the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have started to develop a set of guidelines I mentioned yesterday on managing digital information and how the value of sharing digital research data. Now what they're going to try and come out of that with is an OECD recommendation, which is a technical recommendation to the Council of OECD, but that will show that there is a political willingness amongst nation states to value digital information, value research data in this sense, in this example. But you know, if people sign up to it, and there's hope they will, all it does is saying there's a political willingness to do something about this. We don't know how it's going to be done, but there's a willingness to do something. So at the very high level, you know, I think the big P policies can start to set the agenda within which people can work. Now, I'm less clear how you can apply those, say, to a county record office, but it's a step. I guess it's a step in the right direction. You can then use those as levers. I'm looking to Heather here, but I'm sure there are other archivists here. You can then pick up on these and say, well, look, other communities are managing to do this. Other communities are recognising the value of the digital assets. Maybe we as a community archivist could work together and start to get some, you know, there's some way of getting some sort of high-level statement of the value to the National Archive, you know, the National Archives in the broadest sense, not just the National Archive, but the archives across the UK of work, you know, of the value of digital assets and working to manage those more effectively. So the three things I think, just to summarise, I think the sort of big P policies can do is they can sort of engender the environment, they can set the context, and they can help facilitate the debate, you know, help drive a debate forward. And in the long term, I think they can be used to help leverage funds. Certainly within the Antarctic context, we were able to use that part of the treaty to then go back to the science funders and say, look, you know, we need to start doing something more practical rather than just making mother of an apple pie statements. We need to start doing something more practical. So I would just throw it in at the end of the debate. Right.
Thank you very much to all of you. I'm conscious that time is ticking on, so I think we are going to take a 15-minute break at that stage. So remember everything that you've heard, and we can try and debate it or talk about it after the break. So it's hot in here. Let's open the door and get going. Ask questions. So we've had 2 points of view put forward, and I don't know if anyone wants to get going on a particular issue, but I want to raise something that seems to be a bit of an issue that's being raised, and that's the sort of role of institutional repositories. Kevin was quite put forward quite an interesting point of view earlier, because we do have some regional archives here that are represented in university archives who've made it clear that they don't have exactly the right technical infrastructure in place, and whether or not archives, institutional archives, regional archives should perhaps be distributed, and it's something that you can buy in and use as a service. So these archives and repositories could provide you with the technical infrastructure, and you could perhaps manage the intellectual content as archivists. So maybe we could just kick off on that and see if that's something that it's a need within your communities, and if the funders agree, so to speak.
Helen in New Hampshire Record Office. Part of me thinks that record officers should have a strong link with digital content, because otherwise they will be seen gradually as sort of almost like a museum for paper and parchment. But from our users' point of view, they couldn't care less where the stuff is. They have enough problems at the moment working out geographically where it is and visiting it. So if we were provided with a remote service where we could access and curate the stuff, but the technical headaches were taken off us, that would be a help. But again, we've still got to fund it. Either we fund it in-house or we pay somebody else to do it, and service level agreements and so on. So I'm still in two minds. I don't know what other archivist colleagues think.
Can I just respond to that? When you go onto the BBC website, do you care where the servers are located? Isn't that your answer?
So it's a funding issue, really. That's the main.
Julie Courtney, Gloucestershire Archives. What I'm picking up is the idea of actually trying to work out whether it would be more cost efficient to do that sort of option, or more cost efficient to work with an internal IT structure. And it's working out the cost, which, as you say, is perhaps the area that's not being worked for long-term, really long-term preservation, and we could end up trying to buy into something that was actually way above what we needed long-term. I can see problems in persuading our local authority that that's the way to go. We haven't really got the facts and figures at our fingertips. We may be very reluctant to buy into a service that they just can't see the need for.
Yeah, and we're getting into maybe a slightly different area, but the report that has just come out tries to address exactly those kind of issues. There perhaps isn't enough in there on costing as there ought to be, but at least there's a start where it tries to look at various options of what you might call the do-it-yourself solution, the outsourced solution, and the share solution.
Just to bring to people's attention, I think there are an increasing number of cost models and documents about the costs of preservation starting to come into the community. There's one that I know of because I worked on the project that developed it, but also because it was presented at a different ECC workshop a few months ago. A cost model developed over in the Netherlands for preserving different record types. There's a page on preserving emails, one on spreadsheets, one on databases, one on text documents. And it's a dynamic spreadsheet, so you can enter into it the figures that are relevant for your institution and the scale of the data that you're dealing with and so forth, and it will give you an estimate of the type of costs that you can be thinking about to carry out preservation strategies, and also taking into account things like staffing, things like resources and buildings and so forth that you have to pay for, and it'll give you a rough estimate of how much it will cost. So things like that are starting to appear, and this one's based on experiments that were carried out on to preserve materials, real experiments that were undertaken. So it is quite a useful tool. I think one of the big arguments that you could use, though, with regards to persuading your funding bodies about the benefits of using an external service also brings into play. You have to think about proposing to them, well, hey, what are the costs if we don't preserve? I know somebody else mentioned this earlier, that the costs of not preserving and the problems that are caused by not preserving, particularly with respect to public perception of an institution, can sometimes be a very good argument to try and get money off of your funding bodies.
Helen.
Can I just point you to two projects funded by JISC which might provide you some answers in terms of making a business case to your management for digital preservation, as well as having more insight into the costs of digital preservation across the entire life cycle of digital resources. I was going to tell you about the LIFE project, which has completed and held their end of project conference in April this year. It's a joint project between the British Library and University of London, UCL, University College London. It is about assigning costs to different stages of electronic resources over the entire life cycle. And they have come up with a model which will help you to calculate that cost and actually tested the model with data collected about web resources, e-journals and monographs. And I think they have submitted a bit to JISC for extension of the project, looking into to expand the types of looking at other types of resources. But I mean, at the moment, it's still unclear, if that extension of the project is going to be funded. So that's the LIFE project about costing model. And then another project based at the University of Glasgow called eSpider. I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it is about making a business case for digital preservation by using a model which looks at the value of digital assets and considers the risks, benefits, and costs related to it, so that you can present a comprehensive picture of what you're trying to do. And they have come up with a model as well as templates with a set of questions which you need to answer and ask. And hopefully at the end of this exercise, you can present an A4 page, to go to your management and say, this is the money I need and this is why you have to do it.
Thanks. Joy.
I just wanted to kind of touch again on the issues of interoperability and accessibility. Over the course of the 2 days, it seems like we've been hearing a lot that funders and the case for digital preservation isn't always the top priority, and that access is a bigger issue. But I think it's become quite clear in the past few years that what things that you do for interoperability and accessibility are also very good for preservation. So there's a lot you can do in the short term by pushing those aspects and getting the immediate benefits from that, and then hopefully building upon that later. So if you can get somehow the buy-in, at least for access and interoperability, there's a great potential to kind of shift that at some point later down the line into a preservation sort of policy at some stage. So there are things you can do now with immediate benefits that can parlay over the long term.
Neil.
I mean, I think one of the things you'll find is if you look at all the institutional repositories out there, there are a very wide variety of different structures, architectures, policies all around there. And I think what that's symptomatic of is the fact that really the whole idea of repositories, digital object repositories or whatever, is a very early stage of development. And people haven't sorted out really if there is a right architecture, what that should be, what sort of policies go behind it, what institutions really want out of it still isn't necessarily clearly defined. Since that is the case and there are all these diverse things and there is at the moment no consensus, it's very hard to actually build a service model for it. I think ultimately if you do come to a consensus, then economics dictate that there will be some sort of service model. And I mean, you say for digital legal deposit, Oxford and Cambridge are basically deferring as legal deposit libraries to the British Library, who will actually host the storage part of it, and we will act as ingest points. So, where there is a clearly defined model, that the economics of that make it work. Plus, BL's got a lot more money than we do. So, really, what's happened is the institutional repositories have grown up because of the drive for open access, and the fact that we have this digital material is got to be put somewhere, otherwise we're going to lose it. And as time goes on, JISC is funding a lot of activities, a lot of research into institutional repositories, trying to define the models that sit behind it. And maybe when there is more of a consensus and we move further down the line, there's going to be a case for moving to a service model. And really, this comes back to my point about why object mobility and interoperability is going to be important, because you won't be able to move to the service model unless you're building at the first instance for that mobility.
Can I say something as the person that set this hair running, maybe?
Yes.
There is a lot of investment coming from JISC and others into this notion of institutional repositories. And what worries me is that it's driven mainly by technology. It's not driven by pragmatic solutions. And I think the problem is that the notion of institutional repositories is often bandied around as a solution that fits all sorts of problems. And it may be very good for things like e-prints and teaching materials, where the use is mainly within the institution which is acting as the repository. I think there is a real problem when it comes to resource discovery outside of that institution. Yes, I've read the documents and I'm told by people at Southampton this isn't a problem, but you try and find things in the virtual institutional repositories, and it doesn't happen. There are unequal levels of cataloging, there are unequal levels of the use of metadata, and if people like Oxford and Cambridge can't get it right, well then what about the University of Luton? What about some institutions that, shall we say, are rather less funded than Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh and Glasgow and London? There are 100 universities in this country, and if the top 10 can't actually agree and get it right, then I don't think that's really a good model to then roll out to the other 90%. That's one issue. The other problem is that we have heard time and time again, particularly for those people who are involved in preserving and archiving and providing an after service for research materials, that you cannot just simply take these things as created by the user and put them into a preservation system. They require all sorts of ingest activity in order to make them usable long term. The creator is invariably not a good person to do that. It needs some other specialist input, and I don't see in the institutional model where this specialist input is coming from for research materials. In addition to that, I think there's a third problem. We often talk at the UKDA about, well, we acquire 250, 350 data sets a year. We distribute 17,000 data sets a year. Andrew can put his own figures on this as well. One figure that is never very well quoted is that our help desk also receives over 3,000 queries a year. In an institutional repository, who's actually holding the hand of the user? I don't know. Can't send an email to DSpace. The point is that you have to think of an institutional repository solution in the whole model of preservation, access and support. And to me, it's only one part of the technical solution. It's not a total solution.
Jack Proven, UHI and the TrustER project. I was just interested really in Mark's last point that he made about sort of high-level policy statements and what you said about things not being technical and really being about cultural issues and things like that. And whether you think there's a place for institutions themselves to put out these sort of high-level statements of principle, if you like, about the status of the data the digital data that's created, and if that would engender any change in culture in terms of sharing. Our project is looking particularly at teaching material, and there's not a strong culture of sharing freely outside sort of formal collaborations.
Well, I can speak from sort of our experience in NERC, where certainly having our policy in place has now, within the community, people recognise, well, they recognise they're going to have to do something to meet their policy obligations, but the more savvy people are also recognising the value of doing it for themselves anyway. But I'm a great believer, that the organisation should state what its values are and what it stands for. And if, University of Highland Islands really thinks there is value in preserving its teaching and learning materials for the long term, or the other outputs from research it funds and supports, well, get them to say that, rather than being an implicit policy which sort of adopt it at a lower level. I think the more you can get those at the the Pro Vice Chancellor level to sign up to it and say yes, we really think we the people kind of thing, really value these. It will help drive it along, and everyone, when people say, well, we don't really want to do it, you can say, well, look, it's part of the values, it's part of the policy of our institution to do that.
The issue seems to be that some others have mentioned is that the institutions themselves don't actually know, and they're still groping through these issues and implementing, as Neil said, a range of repositories just to see what use can be made of them. So it's a sort of two-edged thing that they perhaps don't know what their principles are to be able to.
I mean, you could think of some really simple things to start with. I mean, I'm also involved within NERC. I lead on the area of open access publishing and access to research outputs, which is a lot of news at the moment. And but even if say your UHI was to make a statement that they value the published outputs of the research that they support, some simple things like that, would help sort of engender that culture change, I would say. And maybe then they could honestly say, we don't yet know how we're going to manage these and make these available for the long term, but we recognise there is a value in them.
So it doesn't need to be backed up by a really detailed policy, but a fairly short statement.
Yeah, I mean, it helps set the context, definitely. I think.
So I suppose it's really picking up on that same point about the MRC data sharing policy. Really, it's not a bleak picture. It's really just saying to people, why don't you articulate to the research boards and other funders and other bodies some of the things that you're already doing, but you feel that in the past you've not really been given the chance to actually say that. Well, once this research is completed, the anonymised data will be put on our website, and here's the web address, or we use this community database, and or and providing the link to that. So, and it's these same people that are reviewing these proposals, whether they be on the boards or the people it goes out to external peer review, are the data creators as well. So it's they've got a dual role as well. They're seeing that other people are articulating these things that they're doing. So I think it helps to drive that sort of awareness, because I think there's an awareness element as well to this.
Thanks. Anything else from anybody? No? Okay. Oh.
I'd just like to make one last comment, which I don't think there is such thing as an institutional repository. I mean, we're all talking about it like there is one repository at an institution which will hold all that stuff, and that's just not realistic. I mean, our repository is defined very much to be library-like. It does not hold learning objects. It does not hold objects that are in a state of flux within a virtual research environment where data sets are being operated on. We will interoperate with all of those at some point. And to some extent, you can see, UKDA, we cannot handle some of the data sets that they do, but we're not looking to do that role. We handle very specific things which are basically the electronic equivalents of what we would handle as a library. And I don't think it would be insane to try and produce a single architecture which would handle all possible digital things you might want to do stuff with. You know, it's just not possible to design something like that and have reasonable economics and reasonable behaviour and sustainability. So I'm sure what you will find is there will be split models, and you'll have elements of materials sitting within an institution where appropriate, and stuff that sits in large national things, large national services, also where appropriate. I think a lot of it depends on the data, how quickly it changes, who is actually interacting with it, whether your objectives are open access, long-term preservation, and things like that. So you have to look at all of those things and decide where in the sort of total digital storage and preservation and management sort of structure things will have to sit.
Can I just, I just want to say that although JISC is putting a lot of money into developing digital repositories rather than institutional repositories and encouraging the wide deployment of that, I think we do realize that it is certainly, as Kevin has said, not the solution to everything. You know, to what extent these repositories should have a role for digital preservation depends on for what purpose the repository is set up and what kind of content it holds. And there's definitely a need for expertise in, you know, in the preservation and curation of some data, especially scientific data, which I think will be difficult for individual institutions to undertake that role. We have also, I think what we envisage is actually a mixed model with repositories, some repositories at national level, but some other repositories at regional, perhaps consortia, and institutional level. And you know, there is a need for subject-based repositories as well. So I just want to make sure that our capital program in digital repositories doesn't give people the impression that we're going for one solution only, because that's not the way it should be.
Just as a follow-up comment, I think that it's really useful to define exactly what we're talking about when we talk about digital repositories, because there are so many different implementations. There are digital libraries, digital archives, or where does a digital repository fit into this? It doesn't necessarily come along with any of the processes that are established as facets of an archive or of a library. If you look back at the 1996 task force report on preserving digital information, they give a really clear definition of the difference between a digital library and a digital archive. Now we have digital repositories. Where does that fit into the picture? It's not clear enough. And there's the chance that institutions who haven't got a clue about all these terminology issues and semantics will just think, hey, repository, dumping ground, that's where I'll put my stuff. And that's when we get into all of these problems that I think Kevin's mentioned with relation to you have to be so careful about what you put in so that what you get out is going to be valuable and reliable material. So I think it would be a lot more helpful just as a starting point if institutions could not use the term digital repository when they're relating to their institutional collection. It's a great term to use from a generic level, because the software can be adapted to be a digital library or to be a digital archive. But when you're talking about the implementation, what have you got? Have you got a digital library or have you got a digital archive?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Just a few final summing up words. I think the last 2 days we've had a huge range of speakers from both practitioners and funding levels. But I think we agree that a lot of us are in the same boat, tackling the same issues. It doesn't really matter what size your organisation is. I think what's come out of this conversation and debate is that the smaller institutions perhaps have to look to the larger ones to set the context and to set the debate and to leverage funds and funding for policies. But at the same time, the practitioners lower down the scale have to realise the importance of the life cycle and to embed these policies into their workflow. And as Andrew said, they don't necessarily have to be explicit policies, but they should be They're within the organisations, you can call them what you want, but you have to give them value. And value to the data and as well as to the personnel and the people working on them. And I think Susan raised the importance of Edinburgh and training at Edinburgh University, and from the TNA we had the importance of consultation, and that's really interesting and important exercise when you're creating a policy. And I think we've just highlighted that we have to take into account this changing environment, which is changing very rapidly. We still don't know the costs and the realistics of setting up these policies and implementing them. But I think just finally, certainly the DCC and the DPC can play a role to help the funders and the practitioners perhaps sort of, we can meet them in the middle, so to speak, in defining what these policies need to be. And if any of you want to feed your policies to me or to Joy after, to feed them into the debate, we can certainly highlight them on through our websites. And if you want to share these policies, which seems to be quite an important thing to do, then do that. And I think really that's all I want to say. It's been a really, really interesting 2 days. We've all got a lot out of it. So would you join me in thanking the panel and all our speakers in contributing to this successful forum?